My name is Chip Mannequin. I'm professor of philosophy and the director of the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies. I'm standing in today for Professor Yoram Perry, the K director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, since he's away at a conference. I also would like to acknowledge and thank Dean Kevin Close of the School of Journalism and Professor Mac Dester of the School for Public Policy are co-sponsoring this event with the Meyerhoff Center and the Gildenhorn Institute. I was also asked to make some announcements of coming events. What's next? The job market and sports media, which is going to be a panel of professionals sponsored by the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism.
Yes.
All right, Thursday, April 5th, 5 to 7 p.m. Ooh, there's some famous people coming. That looks exciting. Great. All right, yeah. We're actually, the Meyerhoff Center is offering Hebrew courses this summer. Those of you who are interested, sounds like it's a town hall meeting, and two talks which are coming up. But you can actually get these, the brochures for these are going to be in the back, so I don't want to take really time. Order of business today will be as follows. After my introduction, our guest speaker will have the floor, which will then open up for questions, and Dean Close will be the moderator. The official launch of the Crisis of Zionism was last night. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it. I wasn't feeling well. But it's been attacked in the Wall Street Journal and commentary, among other places, already. So I imagine we may have a lively discussion. I just would remind you all that the question and answer session that follows should really consist of questions and answers, and not in speeches and counter speeches. Peter Beinart, he's Associate Professor of Journalism and Political Science at the City University of New York, Senior Political Writer for the Daily Beast Newsweek, and a Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New American Foundation. His first book, The Good Fight, Why Liberals and Only Liberals Can Win the War on Terror and Make America Great Again, was published by HarperCollins in 2006. His second book, The Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, was published by HarperCollins in 2010. The book he will be talking to us about today, The Crisis of Zionism, expands his New York Review of Books essay, which was called The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment. And if I might just say that essay engendered an enormous amount of response, particularly in the organized Jewish community. He's the editor of the blog Zion Square, the Huffington Post, which wishes to facilitate an open and unafraid conversation about Israel, and which entertains a much broader spectrum of views than one usually hears in America. Mr. Beinart has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic Times, Slate, Reader's Digest, Die Zeit, etc., etc. The Week magazine named him Columnist of the Year for 2004. And in 2005, he delivered the Theodore H. White Lecture at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's appeared on NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's The Week, Charlie Rose, The McLaughlin Group, The Colbert Report. If you're going to be appearing in the near future about the Colbert, I'd be interested in hearing that.
On Thursday, actually. Yeah.
Oh, really? Good. Thursday. You heard it here first, almost first. MTV, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, and many other television and radio programs. Mr. Beinart graduated from Yale University in 1993. Bula Bula, what college?
Brantford.
I'm Brantford too.
I shared.
Oh, it's the shared, right. Okay. He won a Rhodes Scholarship for graduate study at Oxford University after graduating from University College, Oxford, with an MPhil in International Relations. Beinart became the New Republic's managing editor in 1995, senior editor in 1997, and from 1999 to 2006 served as the magazine's editor. Mr. Beinart was a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations from 2007 to 2009. Mr. Beinart lives in New York with his wife and 2 children, but until recently, he lived in Washington, D.C., where he and I attended the same synagogue, but I went to the early service on Saturdays, and he went to the later one So we never saw each other. I should also mention the later one that started at 8:30 or something.
Yeah, we didn't get there till 11. So.
In any event,
You guys don't clap for anything.
that's not going to be a tough crowd. In any event, it's a great pleasure to introduce Peter Beinart to the University of Maryland.
This is actually my first book event since my book came out, and really wonderful to be doing it here, partly because my wife is an alum. Partly, it's okay, let's see if you guys clap for everything. It's partly because I'm such a great admirer of Chips. We don't agree about everything, but I find reading him always incredibly stimulating, and if you haven't seen, and so I really recommend his writing to you, and also because I'm a great friend and admirer of Rabbi Ari Israel, who we've known for many, many years, and it's just one of my favorite people in the world. Has done a lot for our family. So I know this is a sensitive subject, the relationship between American Jews and Israel. Recently, a friend of mine asked me about the writing I'd be doing and said, has it provoked any heated rhetoric, angry words, ad hominem attacks? And I said, you mean outside of my own family? Yeah, a few. My mother called to say that it's a good thing that my grandmother doesn't know how to blog. I thought, though I fear she may learn, I thought I would start with a story. I was watching YouTube videos of Tasmanian devils with my then 4-year-old son. Tasmanian devils captured his fascination for some reason. And he went to the bathroom, and I checked my email, and I had an email from a friend in Israel, and the email contained a link, so I checked the link. The link was a video of a Palestinian man in the West Bank being arrested. He was being arrested because he had tried to hook up his village to some water pipes that connected a nearby settlement and military base. You may know, people talk a lot about the issue of land in Israel and the West Bank, but actually issues of equity in water are also very important. According to one study, Jewish settlers in the West Bank use 5 times as much water per person as do Palestinians in the West Bank, which means that in settlements you can often find swimming pools, fairly lush, fairly extensive irrigation systems. According to one study, Palestinians tend to fall below the World Health Organization's recommended level of access to water. And this man himself later told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that there was not even enough water in his village for the children to brush their teeth before they went to school. It's interesting when you think about the question of water. Water is a reflection on national and individual character. That runs very deep in our own Jewish tradition. Think about Genesis, its description of a pastoral society. So for instance, when Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to go look for a wife for his son Isaac, he chooses Rebekah at the well because Rebekah not only gives him water, but waters his flocks. A lot of people in Genesis meet their spouses at wells because wells turn out to be a very good way of testing people's ethical character. So this question of the use of water as a reflection on individual and national character runs very deep in our own tradition. When you think about it, the fact that there would be this disparity in water access in the West Bank is really not very surprising. Jewish settlers in the West Bank are citizens of a state, the state of Israel, that really makes water policy decisions. They vote for that government. Palestinians in the West Bank are citizens of no state. It's not surprising, really, that they would end up on the short end of the stick when it comes to water allocation. This is just kind of one of the kind of mundane realities of what it means to hold millions of people as non-citizens in the state in which they live. It was a difficult scene to watch, this video. The man was being taken away to some kind of paddy wagon-like vehicle, and there were some women from the village who were screaming. And then I saw in the video there was a boy. And the boy was my son's age, looked like. And he was trying frantically through this thicket of adults, villagers, soldiers, to get to his father, as his father was being taken away. And I was watching, and then something happened that really kind of stopped me cold, because the boy was yelling to his father as his father was being taken away, Baba, Baba. And as it turns out, when my son was very little, my son Ezra, we thought that he would call me Abba, Hebrew word for father, but he couldn't say Abba. So he started calling me Baba, and that's the word that he calls me and his sister, Naomi, to this day. So he's coming out of the bathroom, and I think, boy, how do I get back to those Tasmanian devils, but fast, So I click out of it. I thought, he's 4. Then he was 4, now he's 6. What about when he's 12 and he's 18? He sees something like this. What am I gonna tell him? My son is a little budding Zionist. He has an Israeli flag in his room. He goes to a Jewish school. He doesn't really know anything about the Palestinians, but I've noticed he's become very anti-Egyptian as a result of the Passover story. In fact, I haven't even really had the heart to tell him that Israel made peace with them. My conversations with my son about politics actually are not so unlike my conversations with people at the Wall Street Journal and commentary, actually, because I always find he's consistently quite far to my right, often from a very staunchly kind of religious Zionist perspective. He said to me recently, because we're going to Israel in June, I said, where do you want to go? And he said, Mount Sinai. And I said, kind of paused. I said, well, the Sinai, that whole area was given to Egypt. Israel gave that back to Egypt. He gave me this look of horror. He said, to Pharaoh? So anyway, whatever my efforts to inculcate progressivism amongst young American Jews, I'm not necessarily succeeding that well in my own household. It turns out, as it happens, that the Israeli government was also a little worried about this video because it was getting out on the internet a bit, and so they put out a statement which essentially said that the Palestinian villagers had put this boy up to acting in a particularly hysterical manner because they knew there were video cameras around, and they knew that would bring sympathy to their cause. So I thought, okay, so here was my thing I could bring to my son and say, you see, it's okay. What would be the message if I told him that? Essentially, this is not authentic grief. These people don't really cry like that when their parents are being taken away. They're totally radically unlike you. And don't allow yourself to feel any sense of empathy or connection to them whatsoever. And I think, in a way, that's what the American Jewish establishment, the message that American Jewish establishment has been trying to tell young American Jews for several decades now. There's been this enormous effort to desensitize and distract younger American Jews from the reality of what an occupation actually looks like on the ground. And I understand why major American Jewish organizations have done that. I'll even admit that a part of me even sympathizes with them for doing that, because I think they felt that the embers of Zionism, the connection to Israel, amongst young American Jews are so weak, so fragile, that any experience with this harsh and difficult reality would snuff out the little precious Zionism that American Jewish organizations so want to inculcate amongst their children. So I understand why there's been this effort, but I think it's been a tragic failure. And when I say it's been a failure, this is what I mean by the failure of the American Jewish establishment. I mean it's been a failure not only in terms of our ethical obligations to the Palestinians, although I think those are very real, but it's been a failure in producing what I most want my son and daughter to be, which is liberal Zionists, which is to say people who feel a fierce love and devotion and attachment to the state of Israel, not only because they're Jews and because they believe that Jews, given our history, have the right to a democratic Jewish state, but also because they believe that this was a state that was founded on certain democratic principles. And that a state who was founded on whose Declaration of Independence promises complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. And I want them to fight for that vision of a democratic Jewish state against anyone who threatens it. Not only Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Hassan Nasrallah, but indeed, even Avigdor Lieberman and people in Israel's own government, if they menace that vision of democratic Zionism that was born at Israel's creation. And in creating that kind of liberal Zionist, I think the American Jewish organizations have failed. And in order to explain how they failed, I want to kind of try to paint a picture of the American Jewish community as it relates to Israel today. I think you can imagine the American Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel as a kind of a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid is what I call the American Jewish establishment, the kind of alphabet soup of major American Jewish organizations, the AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. I sometimes think that it's only Jews who need an organization simply composed of the presidents of other Jewish organizations. There's something very Jewish about that. I don't know, maybe the Italians do that as well. My wife said to me once, maybe we could apply for membership in the Conference of Presidents of minor Jewish American organizations. And I think if you think about what defines this American Jewish establishment, it's defined by a number of features. The first is generationally. It's really dominated by people who came to their Zionism, their attachment to Israel, really I would say roughly between 1967 and 1982. Between 67, of course, the Six-Day War, when American Jews were roused to a greater Zionism than ever before by the terrifying prospect that Israel would be destroyed by attack by its Arab neighbors, and then this just extraordinary exhilaration that followed Israel's seemingly miraculous victory over its enemies. Followed by the then very dark days in the 1970s of the Yom Kippur War and the 1975 UN Zionism Racism Resolution. This was really, in fact, if you look at the life histories and ages of people who run the Jewish organizations, it really maps on very well. This was really the crucible in which many of them forged their attachment to Israel. Between the 67 war and then Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. What does that mean? It means that they came there to their identification with Israel at a time when Israel was quite different than it is today. When the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population was much smaller as a percentage of the Jewish population than it is today, before the creation of the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party Shas, which has been such a power in Israeli politics, when the settler population was very, very small and the politics and culture and theology of the settler movement were far more marginal to Israel than they are today. And before the Russian immigration of the 1990s that now culminated in the creation of this party, Yisrael Beitenu, led by Avigdor Lieberman. So, in a way, they came of age at a time when, in some ways, Israel was a more innocent place, when the occupation had just started. And in a way, I think one of the functions that the American Jewish organizations serve is that they mirror back this somewhat more innocent vision of Israel, what I would say is even a somewhat kind of Disneyfied vision of Israel, to a generation for whom it resonates because that's the Israel that they connected to when they were young. The second thing that's noteworthy about this American Jewish establishment is that it's composed mostly of Jews who are relatively secular, for whom Zionism and Israel attachment is less an outgrowth of religious commitment than an alternative form of Jewish identity instead of religious commitment. I'll go back later to why I think that's significant. Thirdly, ideologically, I think the American Jewish establishment is defined by a quite profound contradiction, which is if you go on the websites of these organizations and simply try to answer this question, why should we as American Jews, indeed as Americans, support Israel? What you will not find them saying is, we should support Israel because God gave us this land. Look in Genesis. Instead, what they will mostly say is, we should support Israel because Israel shares the liberal democratic values that we as Americans and American Jews cherish. And yet, those organizations never really contemplate publicly the idea, rarely contemplate the idea publicly, that in order to value and cherish Israel because of its commitment to liberal democratic values, you might actually have to be in opposition to the policies of the Israeli government. When those questions come up, they really do the equivalent of turning off the computer. They don't discuss those issues publicly very much, but I think if we're honest, as painful as it is, we have to acknowledge that the threats to Israel's liberal democratic character from within are really quite grave. Israel has a Declaration of Independence which talks about complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. And yet, for 44 years, for 2/3 of the life of the state, Israel has held millions of Palestinians who were barred from citizenship because they're not Jewish. And with the settler population of the West Bank growing, according to a recent Haaretz article, at 3 times the rate of the Jewish population inside what I would call democratic Israel, inside the Green Line, we will get at some point to the time at which it becomes impossible for a Palestinian state to be built on enough of the West Bank for it to be viable and contiguous. The occupation will become permanent. And at that time, Israel will not fully be a democratic Jewish state anymore. It will be something more like an apartheid state. And while those words don't come easily off of my tongue, I say them because in using that phrase, I'm not quoting Jimmy Carter, I'm quoting those two well-known anti-Semites, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, both of whom have warned that this is the future that Israel faces if Israel cannot extricate itself from the West Bank. The American Jewish organizations don't publicly consider it a problem that Israel now has a foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who in his youth was a member of Meir Kahana's explicitly racist party, Kach, who has repeatedly tried to ban Israeli Arab parties from running for Knesset, who, according to Haaretz, at a major party conference in the Galilee in 2009, large throng of Israel Badenu supporters were seen yelling "death to Arabs" at passing cars. And this is not a marginal force in Israeli politics. In the 2009 elections, Yisrael Beitenu came in third. According to Haaretz, in the mock elections held in Israeli high schools, it came in first. That's the second largest party in Benjamin Netanyahu's government. The third largest party in Benjamin Netanyahu's government is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, Shas, the housing minister of which said a while back that he saw it as his national duty as housing minister to prevent the quote-unquote spread of the Israeli Arab population, and the spiritual leader of which, Ovadia Yosef, said last year in a Dvar Torah, a commentary on the Torah, that the relationship between Jews and non-Jews could be analogized to the relationship between a human being and a donkey. I'm not saying this to bash Israel. I'm not saying this to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that this is all that we should know about Israel. I'm saying it for exactly the opposite reason. Because it seems to me that what Israel has accomplished under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, being in a state of almost permanent war since its very existence, its ability under those circumstances to create an independent judiciary, a free press, to give the right of citizenship to its Palestinian Arab citizens inside the Green Line, to have a Palestinian Arab on its Supreme Court, and to have had them in its cabinet is part of the miracle of the Jewish return to sovereignty. For me, that's the miracle. It's not just the creation of a Jewish state, it's the creation of a Jewish state dedicated to the very principles that Europe failed to live up to when the Jews lived in Europe. That's really, I think, what many of Israel's founders wanted. They wanted a Jewish state that would live the principles that Jews had paid such a high price because the countries of Europe had betrayed. And it seems to me it's precisely because we cherish Israel's accomplishments, because we know that what Israel has accomplished is so remarkable under such difficult circumstances that we have to fight to safeguard those accomplishments and not let them be undermined by those people who have a very different vision of the Jewish state than did the people who wrote Israel's majestic Declaration of Independence. Now, people will say, that's all very well and good. For you, as a naive liberal, eating at Zabar's on the Upper West Side, to think that Israel can be that kind of Jewish state. In the neighborhood in which it lives, with the vicious, genocidal organizations and states that Israel has to contend with, Israel cannot afford to live those kind of principles. That's simply not realistic. I disagree. I disagree because I believe that at the core of Israeli security is its democratic character. I believe that nothing imperils Israeli security more than the destruction of Israeli democracy. American Jewish organizations talk a lot about the delegitimization of Israel. They worry a lot about people who don't want there to be a Jewish state in the world. You know what? I worry about that too. But what I don't think they understand is that what legitimizes Israel, what legitimizes Zionism and the existence of a Jewish state, is the same thing that legitimizes any government in today's world, democracy. If Israel remains a democratic Jewish state, it can go and make its case in any arena around the world and win. But if Israel becomes an apartheid Jewish state, it ultimately will be the death of the Zionist project, because that kind of Jewish state will become a pariah state which ultimately will be dismantled in the way that South Africa was. And I don't want my children to live in a world in which that happens. We're often told that liberals who want Israel to live out its democratic principles don't understand the threat of Hamas. Not true. It is precisely because we recognize the threat that comes from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, that we don't want to empower them by making Palestinian leaders who are willing to live with a two-state solution, like Salam Fayyad and Mahmoud Abbas, look like fools and chumps which is what we do when we continue to eat up more and more of the West Bank in response to their willingness to put down arms. If we want to defeat Hamas, the best way we can weaken groups like Hamas and Hezbollah is to show that Palestinians who believe in nonviolence and a two-state solution are actually getting something from it. And the best way we can strengthen them is to make the occupation permanent and show Hamas that a one-state solution already exists, which would make them very happy, since a one-state solution is what many of them actually want. The interesting thing, however, about this American Jewish establishment, the last feature of the American Jewish establishment, to go back to my triangle metaphor, is that it's not reproducing itself in the younger generation. What you find in the younger generation, the kind of bottom corners of this pyramid, is something really quite different. The only place that Zionism is really robust in general amongst younger American Jews is in the Orthodox community. Now, older American Jews sometimes tend to think of the Orthodox population as a very small percentage of the American Jewish population, because in their generation it actually is pretty small. But the Orthodox community is growing very rapidly as a percentage of the larger American Jewish community, because Orthodox American Jews get married earlier, have more kids, don't intermarry very much, and so as a result, the percentage of Orthodox Jews amongst people your age is far higher than it is amongst American Jews in their 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s. And the good news here is that the Orthodox community has done a terrific job of inculcating Zionism in their kids. According to the American Jewish Committee's 2006 study, 79% of Orthodox Jews 18 to 24 18 to 40 said they felt very close to the state of Israel, which I think is good. That's part of the reason we said our own kids go to an Orthodox synagogue. The problem is that the Zionism emerging in much of the Orthodox community does not even pay lip service to the idea that what makes Israel precious is its democratic character. Instead of the Disneyfied Zionism that you often find in the mainstream American Jewish organizations, in the Orthodox community you often find a Zionism of the land, of a deep attachment to the biblical land of Israel without that much concern for the rights and dignity of all the people, Jewish and non-Jewish, on the land. A couple of examples. You may know in New York every year there's something called the Israel Day Parade. It itself is a barometer of these shifting demographics, because it used to be a more secular affair. Now it's really dominated by kids who go to modern Orthodox Jewish schools. And after the Israel Day Parade, they had something in Central Park called the Israel Day Concert, which was an explicitly Orthodox affair. It was co-sponsored by National Council of Young Israel, which is an Orthodox organization. In 2006, a retired Israeli general named F.E.A. Tom gave a very controversial speech in which he called for physically expelling many Palestinians from the West Bank. That was in 2006. In 2007 and 2008, he was the keynote speaker at the Israel Day concert in Central Park. If you look at the posters for the Israel Day concert in recent years, you find that every families can co-sponsor the event, and it's a very Jewish thing. If you co-sponsor the event, you get to put your name on the poster and you put it up everywhere. And if you look closely at the poster, in 2009 and 2010, you will see that one of the families dedicated their co-sponsorship of the event in the name of Rabbi Meyerhoff. I'm not suggesting that most Orthodox Jews hold fundamentally hostile or bigoted views of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims. Again, my own family has gone to Orthodox synagogue for many, many years. But I do think there is often an indulgent attitude in the Orthodox community towards those people who do. And I think the challenge in the Orthodox community, for young Orthodox American Jews who are so important to the future of the American Jewish relationship to Israel because of their deep commitment to Israel and to Judaism, is to reclaim that more universalistic, liberal, humanistic spark that was more present in an earlier generation of Orthodox Jewish leaders, both in Israel and in the United States. You know, when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary, that's of course a conservative institution, but he himself came from a Hasidic Orthodox background, and he heard about the news of Deir Yassin, the massacre of innocent Arab villagers during Israel's War of Independence, he went before his rabbinical students and said, I will not teach today in the shadow of Der Yassin. You can think of all of the excuses that he would have had available to him in a war where 3 years after the Holocaust that had destroyed his entire family, in a war for Israel's very survival, for him to say, you know what, tough things happen in war. He didn't say that. He said, I'm not going to teach today. I'm going to go off by myself and think about whether I need to do tshuva, repentance, whether I bear any responsibility for what was done in Judaism and Zionism's name today, and I would suggest to you do the same. There was a religious Zionist member of the Knesset named Moshe Una in Israel's early decades who said, us religious Zionists, us Orthodox Zionists, we are the moral conscience of the Zionist movement. Those secularists, they'll just do whatever it takes to build the state. But we, as the religious Zionists, are the conscience. And you know what? God doesn't do anything by accident. The Palestinians were not put here by accident. God put the Palestinians here because he wanted to see what we would do with power. He wanted to see what we would do when we were in charge. He wanted to see if we would live out the ethical traditions that Jews came up with when we were weak, now that we had power. This is inside the Orthodox tradition. Rabbi Soloveitchik said after the Sabra Shatila massacre during the Lebanon War that if the Mizrahi, the national religious organization, did not support a government investigation into Sabra Shatila, he would resign from Mizrahi. He said that he would support Israel giving even the Kotel itself to save the life of a young Israeli Jew. All of that, it seems to me, is there for young Orthodox American Jews for the retaking, the reclaiming of an Orthodox Zionism, in fact, it's the conscience of the Zionist movement, and that has a special affinity for Israel's democratic character. The final corner of this pyramid are that larger group of non-Orthodox young American Jews. And here you find that Zionism is really in something like collapse. That same study would show that 79% of Orthodox Jews 18 to 30 said they felt very close to the state of Israel, found that amongst non-Orthodox Jews the same age, the figure was 16%. Some of this is simply assimilation. Some of it is a distancing from Israel because of a distancing from all things Jewish. If people don't know anything and feel anything about Judaism, it's hard to imagine that they're going to feel particularly connected to a Jewish state. And that's why one of the things that I really stress in this book is the extraordinary importance of American Jews, the American Jewish community building a more vibrant Jewish school system. We have arguably one of the weakest Jewish school systems in the Jewish world. Jewish schools are, as I can tell you from personal experience, very difficult to afford and also often academically mediocre. And so we force Jewish parents who want to give their children a Jewish education to often have to sacrifice academic excellence and have to pay an arm and a leg just because they want to do what we're supposed to want them to do, which is actually provide their kids a Jewish education, which is, I think, the foundation of not only Jewish commitment, but also Zionist commitment. But the fascinating thing is that even if you look at that section of the non-Orthodox younger American Jewish population that is not assimilated, that is, in fact, deeply committed to being Jewish. I'm talking about the people coming out of conservative and reform and reconstructionist rabbinical seminaries, the people in the independent Minyan movement, the people who are doing all the remarkable work of religious renewal that is going on in the American Jewish community amongst young people. You find that even here, Zionism is in a lot of trouble. And I think the reason is that these young American Jews are liberals. American Jewish college students are twice as likely to call themselves liberal as are non-Jewish American college students. In some form or another, I mean, what are all these young religious, non-Orthodox religious people trying to do? They're trying to fuse progressive values, egalitarianism for women, with religious commitment. And that's because part of their conception of what makes Judaism precious, what makes Jewishness precious, is the idea that it is a tradition of open criticism, of a belief in human rights, of a belief in free expression, of universalism. And yet they've been given a Disneyfied picture of Israel, which doesn't grapple with any of the hard realities of what it means to actually occupy millions of non-citizens. The very spirit of open questioning and open criticism that they identify as what they most love about the Jewish tradition is strikingly absent often in the mainstream Jewish community when it comes to Israel. And What really strikes me when I talk to younger people of all religions is that they are the most marketed to generation in history. Young people, I find, have this incredibly keen sense of what is authentic and what is not authentic, and they go for the authentic. That's why Jon Stewart does so well, because Jon Stewart is authentic as opposed to the rest of the media, which often seems fake and packaged. And so when you give people fake, packaged, Disneyfied Israel, which doesn't actually deal with any of the hard, messy realities, you don't actually create Zionists amongst people who have progressive, liberal values. You actually turn them away. And I think the challenge here, the problem here, is that many young American Jews have never been told by people in authority that you can both love Israel and hate some of Israel's policies. They've instead been asked to make a choice between their liberal values and Zionism. And to the horror of the American Jewish establishment, they've chosen liberalism instead. And I think the challenge for them is to stop talking about Israeli democracy as an alibi, because Israel's a democracy, there's nothing to worry about here. But instead to start using Israeli democracy as a rallying cry. To say, Israeli democracy, a democratic Jewish state, not just a Jewish state, is your patrimony, it's your birthright. It was won for you at a cost that you cannot even begin to imagine. And it is your job as a generation to safeguard it and pass it on to your children. And if you fail, that will haunt you the rest of your lives, even if you live across the ocean from the state of Israel, because Israel is the great test of Jewish power. Because if it turns out that the Jewish ethical tradition only means something when Jews are powerless, and that when Jews become powerful, the Jewish ethical tradition cannot meaningfully restrain and inform them, then in retrospect, what good was the Jewish ethical tradition to begin with? We have an American Jewish community that doesn't talk about the responsibilities of power. It delights in power. What is AIPAC if not, if AIPAC is nothing if not a festival of Jewish power, and yet, which is particularly meaningful for those American Jews who have a family, who have a memory of Jewish weakness. But the question is, are we talking about the ethics and the responsibilities of power? Even the way we teach our own holidays. We teach the story of Purim as if the story of Purim ends with the Jews being saved from Haman and his genocidal intent. Do we ever talk about what comes after that in the book of Esther? Do we ever reckon with the fact that the story actually culminates with the Jews taking revenge on Haman's people and killing 75,000 people? No, because that's actually a narrative not of victimhood and survival, not of Jewish holidays that start with, they tried to kill us, we survived, and let's eat, which is essentially the way we often talk about much of our tradition, but actually a way of talking about our tradition which is of much more relevance today for American Jews growing up with a very powerful, although still threatened Jewish state, and a privileged and powerful American Jewish community, which is, what does our tradition have to say about the use and abuse of power? It seems to me that's a way to connect young American Jews in a meaningful way, not only to our tradition, but in fact to the real struggle that they need to be part of in Israel. I would tell my son when he gets old enough, if I showed him that video that I saw while he was in the bathroom, that I learned about it because young Israelis went to the West Bank to bear witness to what was being done in their name, because they believed in the idea of Israel's democratic character. And those people find it extremely dispiriting and disheartening when they see the largest Jewish community in the world, a community with its own glorious history of struggling for civil rights and labor rights and women's rights, completely indifferent to the struggle for democratic values in Israel. And I would tell him that 40 or 50 years ago, the best of American Jewry could have been found in places like Mississippi and Alabama, when in the crucible of the struggle for America's democratic future. Although Israel may not be his country, the Jewish people are his people, and he should in some form or another be part of that struggle, because the future of the Jewish people should be absolutely crucial to his own sense of his own honor in his life. Heschel said, "Dark and dreadful would be our life today without the comfort and joy that radiate from the land of Israel." But then he said, Israel's existence alone is not enough. The question is how to make this a state worth waiting 2,000 years for. I think that's the question we should ask young American Jews. how to make this a state worth waiting 2,000 years for, and hope that through their answer, that Heschel Zionism, a liberal democratic Zionism, can be reborn. Thank you.
I just wanted, I'm sorry, I forgot to say that we have 2 microphones. If you want to ask a question, we don't have a traveling mic, but we do have 2 microphones. So please sort of queue up in front of one of the microphones and.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Close. I'm the Dean of the Journalism College at the University of Maryland. Delighted you're here. We have a provocative afternoon program already. And I thank you very much, Peter, for a very concentrated and very carefully stated presentation of your views and of your analysis. And we're going to have, I have here with me as well, others from the faculty, including Mac Dessler, who is former dean of the School of Public Policy, and with us as well. So I will start with, since there are many questions on this side of the assembly. Please introduce yourselves, tell us who you are, and state your question.
Hi, my name is John. I have 2 questions, but if you have time for one, I'll just ask one. Softball. What is a Jewish democratic state?
That's a softball? Okay. A Jewish state, I think, is a state that has a particular responsibility for the security and safety of all Jewish people around the world. A state that offers, that is there to offer refuge for Jews in distress. As I'm old enough to remember Natan Sharansky arriving after years and years in the Soviet Gulag siege. Remember the Ethiopian Jews, some of the most destitute people on earth, brought to the state of Israel. And for me, that idea of a Jewish state as refuge is very important. I also think that a Jewish state has been critical to the survival of Jewish culture and indeed the Jewish people around the world. Think about the recreation of the Hebrew language and what that's meant to Jews around the world. I think that we as a people, to some degree, all around the world, are sustained by the culture that is possible in a Jewish state. Then how can such a state be democratic? How can it offer complete equality to all its inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, and sex? And there is a tension between those 2 things. There's no doubt there's a tension. I start my first chapter of the book by talking about that tension. We have to acknowledge there's a tension. You see the tension in the fact that you have a privileged immigration policy for Jews, or in the fact that you have Jewish symbols in the flag and the national anthem. But I think it's worth remembering first that principles can be in tension without one of them being illegitimate. There's also a tension between economic development and environmental protection, or national security and civil liberties. It doesn't make one of them illegitimate. It's also important to remember that there are many democratic states that have religious symbols on their flag. Many European countries have crosses on their flag. Many Eastern European countries have privileged immigration policies for members of a certain ethnic group. I think that what Israel needs to do to move closer to being a fully democratic Jewish state is to move massively to try to deal with the discrimination that exists against Israel's Palestinian Arab population inside the Green Line. Discrimination that is not a necessary result of Israel being a Jewish state. There's nothing in Israel being a Jewish state that requires that Palestinian Arab villages get less money for education and for roads and for services. Yitzhak Rabin was the only prime minister to really take this seriously when he launched affirmative action for Israel's civil service. He equalized housing allowances. He built health clinics in Israeli Arab neighborhoods. I think Israel needs a massive rededication to that. And at some point, you could even imagine some tinkering with Israeli symbols. So, for instance, Israel has Hatikva, the national anthem talks about the Jewish soul. And that means that Israel's Arab Supreme Court justice can't actually salute his own national anthem. So, if someone were to say you should insert a new stanza into Hatikva, one that was able to speak to Israel's Palestinian Arab population, I don't think that would threaten an idea of a Jewish state. I think it would be a smart move to try to make the idea of a democratic Jewish state more inclusive for all its citizens.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Alana. I just had a question about education.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it was difficult for you to decide how to educate your son about Israel, and how the American Jewish establishment, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. How the American Jewish establishment can really work with education and improve it, where at this point, Hebrew schools are pretty awful in the U.S. And in regards to that,
At every point, they've been awful.
in regards to that, how do we educate ourselves about Israel? And in that sense, how can we work with our kids in order to have that basis for understanding that I think isn't there for a lot of kids who become apathetic to the issue?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I think the first thing is to try, I wouldn't worry so much about teaching Israel to young kids. I would try to teach Judaism. Because I think if you have a foundation and some knowledge of and connection to the Torah, regardless of what particular way you are religiously observant, you have a natural fascination and excitement with the land of Israel. So I would start there. And then I also have no problem teaching a kind of loving, rah-rah version of Israel to very little kids. I mean, they're little kids. I think it's okay for them to start with a sense of love and attachment and devotion. My own son just came back the other day with, a book called, Keeping Israel Safe, the story of the Israel Defense Forces, And that's fine. I don't expect him to, he's 6 years old. Are they going to bring home a book called, The Nakba, How Israel Annihilated the Palestinian People? I mean, he's only in kindergarten. But I think that what you need to do when the kids get older is expose them to Palestinian voices. This is a really important thing. You need to, and this is actually something that Chip wrote about that I've never forgotten that I thought was so moving and powerful. He said, you should bring Palestinian refugees into the Jewish schools and into the synagogue, not for 6-year-olds, but for older kids, and let them tell their stories. We think a lot as Jews about our family's histories, about where we started in one generation, where we ended up. We should just hear that story from them. It doesn't have to come with political sermonizing. Just tell the story of what happened to your family, just to create a sense of human empathy. And I think that would be the beginning. And then to take kids to Israel, and to take them to all of Israel. To take them also to meet Palestinians in the West Bank. And I think that would be a painful and difficult experience for kids growing up with a kind of very Zionist education. But the kids who I meet who are most inspiring to me, the young people, are those who were grounded in Jewish commitment and a connection to Israel when they were young, and then met Palestinians and had to reconsider some of the things. Reconsidering is not a bad thing. I think that would be how I would try to do it.
I'd just like to add, as a historic note, I covered the trial of Anatoly, as he was then called, Anatoly Sharansky in Moscow for the Washington Post, where I was a bureau chief for 4 years. I never got to meet him. I covered the story of his being freed from Soviet prisons and being sent to Israel. I didn't get to ever meet him until I got to Israel myself about 10 years later. So I'm very pleased to meet him.
Interesting.
Your Honor.
Yes, my name is Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired federal judge. And don't you realize by now that almost all the Palestinian Arabs live in Area A in the West Bank and Gaza, and that there was no one in the Israeli government and very few people who want to retake Area A or Gaza. And we're not talking about an occupation of people. We're talking about who gets land in which Arabs are not living now, in areas B and C in the West Bank, which Israel is concerned about because it's learned that it's not going to get peaceful land, that it's going to get probably increased warfare and has to retain strategic areas like high ground and the Jordan Valley. And what you're talking about is it's just not existent. I mean, you can find a few anecdotes about mistreatment of Palestinians, but it's a Palestinian Authority that rules Area A. Israel goes in there once a week and gets 20 people involved in terrorism. And if they didn't go in, there would be 2,000 a week involved in terrorism. But that's the extent of Israel's intervention in Area A. Do you not realize that?
Well, thanks for that. You're absolutely right. that the vast majority of Palestinians live in Area A.
Like 98%.
Yes, but 80% of the land in the West Bank is Area B and C. So essentially what you've done is you've given Palestinians control over, education and services in the Palestinian cities, and you've taken Israel's taken all the land outside of it for area B and C. So, which means that Palestinians can't economically develop into those lands because they're barred from it. It makes Palestinian travel very difficult because you have to go through B and C to get between areas. It's become a little bit easier to get from Palestinian town to Palestinian town through B and C, but Palestinians don't have access, by and large, to East Jerusalem, which is their natural economic hub. They don't have access to the area of the West Bank on the other side of the separation barrier near the Green Line. Many of them don't have access. They don't have access to the Jordan Valley. So yes, you can say that the Palestinians are under Palestinian self-government in these cities, but they're imprisoned in these cities with Israel controlling all of the land outside of it, which doesn't really make for a very viable economic or political existence. And the Israeli, as you kind of acknowledge, but the Israeli government kind of subcontracts the occupation to the Palestinian Authority in Area A, but the Israeli government goes in to Ramallah and to Area A whenever it wants. It's still the ultimate military authority, even in those areas. It controls the borders, it controls the currency. Israel can deny Palestinians, can deny tax receipts to Palestinians when it wants. So Israel is in control. I'll finish, and then I don't mind if you want to have a response, but I think according to the United States government, it's also worth remembering that the United States government considers Israel to be occupying in Gaza. That's the position of the United States government. It's the position of the United States government in part because 1/3 of the arable land inside the Gaza Strip is off limits to Palestinians because Israel has erected a security barrier inside the Gaza Strip from which Palestinians are off limits. That's one of the reasons that the United States government considers Gaza.
Could you point me to a document or a person who has said that
The
to the
CIA.
U.S. government?
Yeah, I have a citation in my book. It's from the CIA website. Yes.
Oh, the CIA?
The CIA, which is part of the U.S. government, whether we like it or not. I don't agree that land for peace is impossible. I believe that the flaw in using the analogy of Israel's dismantling of settlements in Gaza as a kind of predictor of what would happen with a Palestinian state, even though there are security risks to a Palestinian state. I would never deny that there are not security risks to the creation of a Palestinian state. There are security risks. I just think they're not as great as the risk of creating a one-state reality and having a struggle for that one state, which will inevitably mean Israel's destruction as a democratic Jewish state. But the reason the Gaza analogy, I think, is wrong is there was no peace deal. The better analogy, it seems to me, is when Israel actually has made peace deals. It made a land for peace deal with Egypt. It made a peace deal with Jordan, and those have actually held up pretty well. And
It made a deal with the Palestinian Authority called Oslo,
Yeah.
and as soon as Israel moved out of those areas, they were attacked. There were roadside bombings from the beginning. There were bombings of buses in Jerusalem, and finally there was an intifada. This was under an agreement. It was the Oslo
yes,
Accord.
but not a state.
But
There was an agreement that the Palestinians believed would lead them to a state, and for a whole variety of reasons has not led them to a state. The Palestinians bear culpability for the fact that Oslo did not lead them to a Palestinian state, but the fact that Israel's settler population almost doubled during the time of Oslo didn't help either.
I'm going to,
I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards if you like.
Yeah, we're fine. Judge Grossman and I we go back a ways, so we know each other very well. Please.
Hi, my name is David Meyer. I am a junior here, and I'm also active with J Street on campus. And I want to ask for a little bit of an elaboration on John's question on the Jewish and democratic state. Particularly, I'm someone I grew up in, and I'm active in the Zionist youth movement. I'm very much attached to my Zionist identity, but I am constantly fighting with myself over my own inability to justify Zionism morally. And I guess what my question is, given the problematic aspects of Zionist history before and after 67, how do you, Peter Beinart, the author of The Crisis of Zionism, find Zionist ideology, like how do you justify it in particularly in regards to the existence of a Palestinian population that was there before we were.
I have to say, the whiplashing of these two questions is something I find again and again and again and it's part of what's to me so extraordinary and also frightening in some ways about the moment we live in the American Jewish community. Because I've never given a speech on a college campus where someone hasn't asked me, a Jewish kid hasn't asked me that question, which is essentially, why are you a Zionist at all? I will give you my answer. The first answer is that I believe that our history of experience in diaspora, gives us the right to a state dedicated to our refuge. Now I know that for young American Jews, it's kind of hard to imagine that you would ever need to go to a Jewish state, and you maybe don't even see any Jewish population around the world necessarily that seems like it does. But our experience is only a small slice of Jewish history in the United States today. If you look at the long scope of Jewish history, I think it's a little bit hubristic for us to give up, to imagine that we would never need such a state again. And if you talk to your counterparts here, whose families grew up in the former Soviet Union, or even Jewish families, or even grew up in Latin America, because they might not be as blasé about it as sometimes native and born American Jews are. So that's my first answer. And I probably say that because I was deeply influenced by the Soviet Jewry movement and the Ethiopian exodus of the 1980s. I'm old enough to remember that. The second reason I would give is because I think that we have been the existence of a Jewish community in the land of Israel, which has been protected by a Jewish state. I don't think the Jewish community could have flourished and grown in the way it had it not been protected by a Jewish state, has enhanced our lives as Jews around the world in such profound and dramatic ways. The recreation of the Hebrew language. I mean, imagine, where would we be without the fact that the Jewish population in the land of Israel recreated the Hebrew language? And so that kind of cultural Zionism that Achad imagined, radiating around the diaspora, I don't think would have been possible without the hard shell of the political Zionist state around it. And the third answer is that I'm an anti-utopian liberal, at least a non-utopian liberal, which is to say, I believe that we have to change the status quo, but we have to remember that we have to think about real-world alternatives, not alternatives that might look great in the abstract. And for me, a secular binational state, while it has appeal in the abstract, especially to those of us who grew up in the United States with a separation of church and state, I don't think would work in reality. Binationalism is very hard in practice. Even in Czechoslovakia, they couldn't make it work. In Belgium, they can barely make it work. These are two populations that have been at war for 100 years. What would an Israeli military, what would a military of a secular of a binational state look like? It would be half Palestinian, half Jewish. It would be rival militias under the guise. You think it's hard to dismantle the settlements? Imagine dismantling the IDF. So I think that in reality would be worse for both Jews and Palestinians. I think it would be the recreation of the civil war of the 1930s. And that's why I cling to the belief in a democratic Jewish state alongside a democratic Palestinian state.
Thank you. I used to cover Canada, I should say, for the Washington Post, and there between French Canada and English Canada, they call themselves the two solitudes.
Hi, my name is Tracy Siegel. I'm a senior here. My question is that I've been a part of this young Jewish liberal community of which you speak for a while, and I myself have felt very helpless to change any of Israel's policies from America. Like, I never struggled with the identity part of being Zionist and being critical, but being critical here didn't seem to make any sense to me. I'm making Aliyah in July because of that. And I think that helplessness is something that really defers that liberal community to just straying away from Zionism. And I'm just wondering how, especially moneyless young college liberal Jews are supposed to feel any power to make a difference in Israel's democracy.
That's a great question. I would say the power you have is that older American Jews need you if their organizations are going to survive. And a lot of them are very worried about the future of their organizations because they recognize that they're having trouble, some more than others, but are having trouble attracting younger American Jews. And so I would say to those people in whatever organization strikes your fancy, that you want to be involved in the organized Jewish community, but you want it to reflect your values and your experience. And so you want Right now we have with the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee this very bizarre situation in which they have been willing to criticize some anti-democratic legislation within the Green Line, some of the stuff that Lieberman and his party have pushed, which is great. And yet they're still unwilling to speak out. So they're concerned about the diminution of rights of those Palestinians inside Israel who already have citizenship. But they won't say anything about the rights of Palestinians who don't have citizenship at all. And they need people like you. They really do. And I think if enough of you were to say, we want to be involved, but we have a vision of these organizations that's actually truer to their own founding documents about fighting discrimination and promoting human rights, including in Israel, actually you would have an impact.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dan. So I was wondering, you mentioned democratic a lot, and I was wondering, how do you respond to the idea that Judaism isn't necessarily democratic in a lot of places? In much of Jewish identity and Jewish religion, it's not democratic. It's a relatively modern phenomenon for.
Yes, that's true. You're right. There have been people smarter and more learned than me who have tried to find elements of democracy in the Jewish tradition, but put that aside. You can find all kinds of things in the Jewish tradition if you look hard enough. I think the more relevant question is it there in Zionist tradition, in the tradition of people who founded the State of Israel? And there are a lot of different Zionisms, but I think when I look at Israel's Declaration of Independence, or even when I look at Herzl's writing, I do see a vision of a state that was supposed to be governed by Enlightenment principles. And so I think that was very much the ethos that the people that many of Zionism's founders came out of. Now, did Israel always live up to it? No, Israel didn't always live up to it. Israel did some very brutal things in its founding. The United States also did some very brutal things in its own history. Didn't always live up to its founding principles. But I think that Enlightenment ideas are very much a part of the Zionist tradition, and therefore I think you can find them there, regardless of the degree to which you believe you can find them in Judaism itself.
So how would you appeal to those young Orthodox you were talking about who aren't necessarily, who would argue that it's not democratic, that Judaism isn't necessarily democratic?
I think I would say, one thing I would say is that simply as a matter of pure self-interest, even if you had no moral concern, I don't think the future for a non-democratic Jewish state is bright. Because I believe that in terms of Israel's relations with the rest of the world is not going to be sympathetic to a non-democratic Jewish state. And ultimately, non-democratic states of all nature, it seems to me, are very susceptible at some point or another to revolution. And I think a non-democratic Jewish state would essentially be susceptible to Palestinian revolution in a one-state context. So I think even as a pure matter of practicality, I don't think it's a very good idea for securing Israel's future.
Yes, sir.
My name is Rocky Kaur, and for a long, long, long time I was associated with Habonim, later Zionist movement, and they turn out lots of interesting people over the years. There is a catch-22 to this discussion as we're comparing a Jewish democratic state with the United States of America, and I was most reminded of that because of what is going on in Capitol Hill right now at the Supreme Court building, which reflects 300 years of struggling between three branches of government, which Israel has also, and the thing that links them all together. And it has taken 300 years, or 200 some years, for that to work its way out, and it's still working its way out in terms of that. And that is, when a major issue comes up, it is put back against the foundation of the whole thing, which is what we call the Constitution and all the legal system behind it. And 64 years ago, David Ben-Gurion, bless him, bless his memory, made a tactical decision, which we all live with now, and which no one has brought up. He made a decision, and it is one of the reasons why that wonderful sounding Declaration of Independence of Israel is ignored by government after government after government. Why? Because what happened here, when we did our wonderful Declaration of Independence, we immediately created a structure of law called the Constitution and amendments to give it teeth. There are no teeth in the Declaration of Independence in Israel, and this leaves out all the other issues. What about a constitution at this point in history?
Well, that's such a great question. As you know, there are these basic laws that have been passed that the Israeli Supreme Court in this kind of constitutional revolution under Ahab Barak has kind of used as a kind of constitution-like document in the sense that they have given themselves the right to strike down Knesset legislation which violates those basic laws. And so that seems to me a kind of an effort towards creating a system that has something closer to our idea of a Bill of Rights. But it's very embryonic, and the Supreme Court is being tested in its ability to actually make its own judgments stick all the time.
Just like follow, are we so far along now where there are all of the different forces in Israel,
Yeah.
including the religious and the secular forces, that they cannot ever come to a constitution?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, you're right. I mean, the wisdom, of course, is of the fact that we did ours back, when we did it, is that we don't have to try to have a constitutional convention now. I mean, you think the Israelis would have a lot of trouble, but we would have a lot of trouble too. You can imagine what it might be like. So I just don't know the answer to that. It's part of the larger issue of the demographic change in Israel that's very worrying. You have populations, growing populations in Israel that are really not very connected to liberal democratic values or culture. In the Haredim, in the national religious, to some degree in the Russians as well, and that's very frightening. But I think it just makes it all the more important that we support those elements in Israel who really do believe that that this must be a state that lives according to liberal democratic norms.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Howdy. My name is Sean. 2 questions, okay?
Can you, if they're both very fast?
I'll say both of them. And then, the first part is, as a non-Jewish American, what is my interest or the U.S.'s interest in Israel, especially when coming from a realist foreign policy perspective? And then, considering current social, demographic, economic, whatever trends in the U.S., Israel, Palestine, Egypt, whatever, how long do you think until either the one-state/apartheid solution is inevitable, or if you don't want to give a date or a time estimate, what kind of markers would you look for that would signify that that's inevitable?
Great, those are really good questions. All right, the U.S. interest. So, look, America and Israel do a lot of security cooperation together, I think that helps the United States in a lot of ways. Now, sometimes, America, I wish America hadn't been in Iraq, but clearly when America gets itself in messes like Iraq, we look to Israel to try to learn from what they've learned in dealing with fighting against insurgencies and against terrorism. Again, I wish we hadn't had to learn that, had to gain that wisdom that much, but I think that there's no question that in the fight against jihadist terrorism, which does threaten the United States, the security cooperation that we get from Israel is quite significant. On the other hand, and Israel is an ally of the United States. I mean, Israel just basically, classic realist terms, Israel basically supports the United States agenda on lots and lots of things, right? Not always when it comes to Israel's own narrow, particular interest, but if it's got to do with some random other thing, Israel's probably going to go along with the United States. On the other side, but I think that Israel's occupation does not help the United States strategically, because I think it creates lots of hostility in the Muslim world, hostility that can lead to a greater security threat and increased threat of terrorism to the United States. And I think so. The occupation, I think, really is a security liability to the United States, and I think that a lot of people at the top of the U.S. military believe that. I mean, it's actually one of the least commented on. One of the things that went kind of unnoticed in the Baker-Hamilton Commission report which called for the U.S. pullback from Iraq was their claim that during Israel's 2006 Lebanon war that there was a corresponding spike in attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, which was a very controversial and provocative thing for them to say, but it was clearly coming out of their experience talking to the U.S. military. On the one-state solution, the marker, look, in my darkest days, I feel a little bit like we're, the roadrunner who's already gone off the cliff and just hasn't looked down, So how do you know you've gone off the cliff? Because you look down. I hope that's not true. I really hope that's not true. But I think that clearly, if the Palestinian Authority were to collapse, if there were to be an intifada, a Tahrir square amongst the Palestinians that washed away the Palestinian Authority, then I think we could move quickly into a one-state reality. Because I think that the Palestinian Authority is partly what anchors the idea of a two-state solution, this government in waiting kind of there. And also,
delegitimize you more than they are already?
Well, if it were simply to be pushed out of power altogether, and you were to go back, you were to go to some kind of anarchic situation in the West Bank where there was no Palestinian Authority in charge at all, then I think that might lead us much closer towards a one-state reality. Also because the Palestinian Authority guys, they're invested in the two-state solution because they know they're going to be running the state. Other Palestinians are probably less invested in it because they're not the guys who are basically going to be getting all the benefits of statehood necessarily. So I think that would be something that could happen, I fear, relatively quickly.
Thank you.
My name is Michael Friedman. I'm a professor in kinesiology and in some ways a member of the American Jewish establishments. Check all three boxes that you described. I serve on a couple of boards. But my question basically has to do with the peace process and the need for a two-state solution, which in many ways is much more in the interest of Israel than it is of Palestine, because the Palestinians see that they have time. How do we get to a two-state solution, especially when Dennis Ross says that there is no viable partner for peace, and every proposal that Israel has put forward has basically been rebuffed, with the Palestinians essentially demanding considerations that would, in 100 years, make that one-state solution inevitable?
Oh, that's a good question. So I guess I would answer this a couple ways. First of all, even if I took the most pessimistic possible interpretation of the Palestinians, if I agreed with you that they've rebuffed every offer, that they have no interest in a two-state solution, that they have a culture of hate, whatever it is, I would still say, if your goal is a two-state solution, we need to get a handle on the process of settlement growth. Because if you want a two-state solution ever, you're going to need to make sure that you have enough territory in the West Bank for that Palestinian state to be contiguous and viable. So even if you thought that you only thought you could get a Palestinian state in 20 years, I would still say that we should stop the subsidies that subsidize, that make it cheaper for Israelis to live on the West Bank than inside the Green Line. And in fact, we should start thinking about how we subsidize some of those Israelis who have gone to the West Bank because it's cheaper to come back. I don't agree with your narrative of what's happened with peace deals in the past. I spent some time in the book saying this, which is not to say I'm not critical of Palestinians. I'm very critical of Palestinians. I call Arafat's role in the Second Intifada a crime. I think I have all kinds of nasty words for him. But I think that the Israeli offer made by Ehud Barak at Camp David, which was the last offer, which was for 91% of the West Bank with a 1% land swap inside Israel and Israeli control over the Jordan Valley for 12 years, was not. There's a reason that Shlomo Ben Ami, the Israeli foreign minister, has said if he were a Palestinian, he would have rejected that offer too. The more sophisticated critique is not that the Palestinians should have accepted the offer, but that they should have made an offer of their own, that they should have counter-offered. But the complicated thing about this, and this is what's so difficult about the whole process, is that there are Israeli people from the Israeli negotiating team, like Gilad Sher, who was Barak's topic, who said that Palestinians did counter-offer. He said that Palestine, and there are other people, the literature is very inconsistent on this. If you look at people like Clayton Swisher's Truth About Camp David, or Charles Enderlin's Shattered Dreams, there are a whole series of people, including Israelis, who said that Palestinians had an offer on the table which was more like a 2 or 3% equal land swap. Plus, they didn't want Israeli control of the Jordan Valley, and they wanted all the Arab neighbors to be Jerusalem, whereas Barak was only prepared to give them a capital on some of those neighbors. So, the truth is we don't really know and we'll ever really know. But it's not quite fair to say that Israel gave the Palestinians everything they could have wanted and the Palestinians said no. There were even Israeli negotiators like Yossi Beilin and Gilad Sher who believed the Palestinians would have given up on the right of return. They would have accepted a legal fiction in which they had the right of return, but Israel got to control its immigration policy, and Israel would have allowed maybe 10,000 a year for 5 years or something like that. So it's not as clear-cut as I think we in our often really insular Jewish dialogue tend to believe. Olmert, it's also about the 2008 negotiations, that Olmert has himself said that Abbas was negotiating seriously and they believed they were quite close. Abbas wanted a 1.9% land swap, and Olmert wanted a 6.3% of the West Bank with a 5.8% giving back inside the Green Line. The reason I'm giving all this stuff is people say that the Palestinians will never give up on the right of return. They may be right. They may be right. We don't know. We don't know. But we certainly know that we will never even get to the point of them having to face that question if we can't offer them a state that is really 95% plus of the West Bank. Because when the Palestinians say they don't want to deal with it, they don't want a state in which they have settlements cutting through and impairing their contiguity, they have a reasonable point. I mean, Ariel is a big problem for them. It goes 13 miles through the northern West Bank and essentially cuts off the northern cities like Tulkarm and Qalqilia from the West Bank. So if we want to really pressure the Palestinians on the question of right of return, we have to at least be able to deal with these territorial questions too.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Olin Kaufman, and first of all, I wanted to thank you for coming here and speaking to us and sharing your insights. This has been very interesting, and I appreciate it. I'm sure as everyone else here has. My question is, as you may have noticed by my name, I'm Israeli born and raised. I'm here only for studying. And this concept of the Zionist Jewish American almost sense of entitlement to the state of Israel is foreign to me because I was born there. I'm from there. This is my country, and I will defend it because that's where I live, not because it's the ideology that I need to protect, because if not, I might die. And with that, I wanted to ask you, you've talked a lot about strengthening the connection between the American Jewish establishment and the land of Israel. But I was wondering, for me, I can work to try to ameliorate the situation from within. I can run for Knesset if I so choose. I can vote. I can serve in the IDF. But for my peers here and elsewhere throughout the states, what is the role? Who are they operating with? How exactly are they, with the greatest intention in the world, to help me, or not, to try to better the situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I guess I would say that although American Jews can't express themselves in Israeli politics and Israeli life in the same way that Israelis can, obviously, we are implicated. We do play a role, partly because we play a large role in our government's policy. And the Israeli relationship with the United States is very, very important for Israel's national security. There's a reason that the Israeli leaders schlep to AIPAC every year and spend so much time here. It's because that is the great strategic accomplishment in some ways of Israel's foreign policy, the strategic relationship with the United States. And it's undergirded politically not only, but very significantly by American Jews. The reason the foreign aid bill is passed every year in large measure by AIPAC's lobbying. So we do play a role. Therefore, the question for me, it seems to me, is are we playing as constructive a role as possible? And I would say I think we're not, because I think that although America should have a very strong military relationship with Israel, and we should help ensure Israel's military advantage, we should not help Israel to do things that I think are very dysfunctional for Israel and which ultimately harm Israel's security, like subsidizing West Bank settlements. So I think the question is there, given that we're already playing a role, how could we play that role better?
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Diane Tuckman, and I'd like to put my question in context. My family and I escaped from Egypt in 1948, and the people who cried the loudest were all the Arabs that we were connected with in our family. The relatives said, "Why are you leaving? Everything's okay," but they were really touched by that whole event. And my question is that basically there's Jews everywhere in the world. I mean, I cannot think of too many countries where there are no Jews, or now some have gone, but everywhere I travel in the US and many countries abroad, I constantly run into Jewish people. "Oh, you're Jewish, blah, blah, blah." And then the next comment is, "Where are you from?" and so forth and so on. So anyway, Israel has had to confront the integration of a huge number of people from many different civilizations and so forth. I'm Sephardic, but all sorts of things. And I really admire Israel for doing that. How in the heck do they continue to do it?
That's a great question. And I should say, that my grandmother left Egypt at almost exactly the same time. My grandmother's maiden name is, and in fact I write about her in the book, maiden name is Al-Beldas. Her mother was from Rhodes, her father was from Izmir in Turkey, they were in Alexandria. And then, so maybe we have more to talk about. They made some strange decisions. They moved to the Belgian Congo. In fact, one of my favorite, I'm sorry, I have to digress, but one of my favorite stories about the Jews of the Belgian Congo, who were quite insular in some ways, was that after the Jews of Rhodes were wiped out during the Holocaust, but there were some orphans who were in displaced persons camp, and so they sent them to live with family members in what was then called Elizabethville, what's now Lubumbashi in the southeastern part of the Congo. And I remember one of my uncles saying the sense of kind of happiness that when they saw these kids, that they said to each other, thank goodness they've come out of barbaric Europe and come to the Congo where people can be safe. Which I just always kind of love that as an idea. I think it is an amazing, amazing accomplishment, and perhaps one that we on the American Jewish left and left don't celebrate enough. And for me, it's what makes Israel it's part of what makes me Zionist. It's part of what I think is just so extraordinary about Israel, is to see these populations disconnected for hundreds, if not thousands of years, come together and scream at each other, yell at each other, rip each other off, cause each other strife, but live together and interact with each other. It's just an amazing, when you're there, it's just an amazing thing to witness. The diversity and the interaction between the two communities. And I think what an extraordinary thing it is to be able to live in this moment in Jewish history, to be able to see that. Even though Israel often doesn't always treat the new immigrants so well, and they always say, everyone was great until they got here and they fight, it's still an incredible process to watch, and I think there's a lot for us to be proud of.
Thank you.
This is going to sound kind of dry and academic, but you make an argument for strengthening the democratic heritage of Israel based on security, which I agree with, that eventually, if they lose democratic legitimacy, they become a pariah state. But being a pariah state, presumably, at least from the way that I understand it, means losing great power support, losing support of the United States. And I agree with you, but I have a worry. And as one of the previous questioners had pointed out, there are people in the United States whose, the Orthodox, for example, whose support for Israel isn't predicated on the democratic values. And there are other groups as well. We talk about the American evangelical support. So my question is this worry legitimate, that even without the democratic elements of that Israel would be able to retain enough support in the United States, especially, to sustain itself from the security standpoint?
Yeah, that's a really good question. These questions are all really good. I guess I would say, first of all, that the United States alone, I think the United States relationship is very important to Israel, but it's not the only important relationship. Economically, the European relationship may be more important. And increasingly, and so the question is, if you really lost Europe, and you had Europe moving towards a much more fundamental hostility to Israel, there would be a huge blow to Israel, even if the evangelicals and the Orthodox, whatever, kept the relationship here in the United States. I also think that the relationship in the United States may look a little more solid on the surface than it is underneath. When you question, I would say, first of all, I think there is disaffection on the American left inside the Democratic Party. It doesn't express itself at the political level because members of Congress are kind of inside Washington, but out there in the country, I think it's definitely grown. You can see it in the liberal blogosphere. I think there's also a kind of isolationist right tendency. You see it in the Ron Paul movement that is frustrated with Israel because Israel keeps dragging us into the Middle East. We want to get the heck out of the Middle East. And I think the last part, which is the military. If I were, from the perspective of the Israeli-U.S. relationship, I think that Israel's biggest worry is the U.S. military, actually. That it may be an emerging officer corps who does not see Israel as a strategic asset. People who have learned Arabic, spend a lot of time following Middle Eastern public opinion, are upset. It's fascinating to me that Gates was the person who was the furthest left inside the Obama administration on Israel. He's the one who wanted to put the most pressure on the defense secretary. Now Panetta has also been making these noises. We saw what Petraeus said. I think that this is a potentially bigger force even than the kind of liberal Jewish J Street movement in terms of pushing a different set of policies in Israel. And if I were American policies in Israel, and if I were Israel, I would be worried about that. The Israeli government would be worried about that.
Thank you.
So, having a discussion about feeling powerless as an American Jew, like what can you do to, I guess, liberalize Israel? Do you see boycott and sanctions as some kind of solution that we can do over here as a Jewish activists, or any form of that, whether it's just divestment or
As it happens, I wrote an op-ed about that subject, which got a little bit of attention. I support not buying or investing in companies' products from the West Bank, but taking that money and investing in a democratic Israel. So for me, that's the twin move. And I say that because I fear that we are, both the Israeli government settlement policies and the BDS movement are working like a pincer towards a one-state solution. They have different one-state visions, but the Israeli government is creating a one-state reality. The BDS movement is using that approaching one-state reality to make it easier for them to try to do to Israel what they did to South Africa under apartheid, which is dismantle it. And I think we need an effort to redraw the green line and to emphasize to legitimize democratic, not allow people to use the West Bank to delegitimize Israel, but also not allow the Israeli government to use democratic Israel to legitimize the West Bank. And that's why I believe that we have to draw a distinction between the way we deal with democratic Israel and the way we deal with the West Bank, even though it's very uncomfortable for me to propose doing that. Any form of, of kind of exiling of any Jews from my, circle, from my connection is not something that I consider pleasant at all. But I think that we have to start a conversation about how we're going to deal with the creation of this one-state reality. We cannot keep sleepwalking towards it, and I find it very frustrating when people who say that they support a two-state solution, in practice are supporting policies that are making the two-state solution ever more remote.
If I could follow up, I remember Houthi was here about a month ago. Okay.
I'm sorry,
I'll be around.
A few minutes over, and there's one gentleman just joined the queue here and made it a queue once again. If you don't mind, pursue your question afterwards. And now I'm going to ask Professor Dessler to give us closing remarks after your question and answer.
My name is David. This is more of a personal question. I'm just wondering, how have your views evolved over the years, and have you struggled with that? And I'm actually curious to know whether they've evolved since the time or during the time you were the editor of the New Republic, and what that was like, and maybe working with Marty Peretz.
Let me defer the question about working with Marty Peretz, but I think, although to say that I owe him a lot because he gave me my first job in journalism. I think, my ideas have evolved. Actually, the views of a lot of people have evolved, actually. It's interesting if you look at a whole series of writers, Fareed Zakaria, Joe Klein, Andrew Sullivan, Jacob Weisberg, a lot of people a little older than me, perhaps. There's been an evolution. I didn't write about Israel very much when I was in the Republic. That was kind of Marty and some really on Weasel Tears terrain. It mattered a lot to me, but I felt like it was covered, and I was also really conflicted about it, to be honest. I just felt like it was only going to lead me to grief to write about this subject. But I grant, after Lieberman's emergence, and after some personal experiences of kind of confrontation with things that had happened in the West Bank, I just began to feel that I could not express myself as a writer and as a journalist if I didn't write about the thing that was closest to who I was, and that I also would not really be able to face my own children if this democratic project goes down, if I just stood on the sidelines the whole time. So I thought, I'll do it, and it'll be an interesting ride. And it's been an interesting ride, and the ride continues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Kevin has given me the honor of closing this event. I want to do three very quick things. First of all, I want to introduce my friend Stephen Stern, son of Saul Stern, whose professorship I have the honor of holding. I just would observe that Saul was in so many ways the epitome
of deep dedication to liberal values, activism on the political scene. Just I think, and he would have been both appreciated and been deeply troubled at the same time by much of what you have been saying. The other thing I want to say is that a talk can be measured by its own quality in terms of whether it's provocative, intelligent, perhaps controversial. Second, it can be measured by the comments and questions that it generates. My sense, and I don't think I'm alone in this room, is that this rate's very high on both counts. Independent, to some degree anyway, independent of whether people agree or disagree from the right or the left with what you said specifically, Peter. So I really think we are, and I'm delighted that through Stephen actually, and through Yoram Perry, who was not able to be here today, but was very committed to having this event. I'm delighted that the Saul Stern program was able to be a co-sponsor. And I guess my final point is I'm going to get in line to have my books signed.